Hello, thanks everyone for attending Why Net Neutrality Matters for Business. My name is Ryan Rabac and I'm the Marketing Director here at the American Sustainable Business Council. Just to give you an idea of who we'll be hearing from in this presentation, I'll start off with a little bit more information about ASBC and our work on net neutrality, and then we'll move on to Ilyssa Meyer, Manager of Public Policy and Research with ETSI, and then we'll hear from Evan Engstrom, Executive Director of Engine. And then finally, we'll hear from Phillip Berenbroick, Senior Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. So ASBC is working on net neutrality as early as 2014 when we sent a letter to then Chairman Wheeler urging the FCC to protect a free and open internet. Last September, we got back involved in the issue as it looked like the FCC was moving towards repealing that rule. We submitted a public letter to the FCC on behalf of over 500 small and medium-sized businesses in partnerships with our friends at the Small Business Majority and Main Street Alliance. We've continued to work on restoring net neutrality with our business members through things like direct meetings with lawmakers, advocacy actions, press opportunities, op-eds, and other things like that. If you haven't signed on to this effort yet, our page is up at netneutrality.asbcouncil.org. If you do that, we can get you plugged into these efforts and opportunities and keep you up to date when new ones come up. We're also working on State Bill 822 in California, which is a state-level model bill for net neutrality. And for those that are in California or interested in that work, I would encourage you to sign on with us at canetneutrality.com. Today, ASBC will also release our business case for net neutrality document. This is a quick three-pager that talks about the loss of net neutrality and the threats that poses to business of all sizes and industries, the potential economic impacts, research on that topic, and thoughts from some of our business members. So that's available as of today. Before I move on to our expert panelists, I wanted to cover some new small business polling from Small Business Majority. So this was commissioned with the Chesapeake Beach Consulting to conduct a national scientific opinion poll of 500 small business owners nationwide. The poll found small business owners oppose the FCC's repeal of net neutrality, and that many small businesses feel net neutrality is important to the operation of their business. So if you can see here in the chart, 56% opposed the FCC's repeal last year, with roughly 4 in 10 strongly opposing the repeal. And I think it's also interesting and important to point out the don't know section here. So we've got 14% who said they don't know. So there's still some work to be done educating fellow businesses and colleagues about the importance of net neutrality. Moving on to the next one, nearly half of small businesses say net neutrality is important to the operation of their business, with 1 in 4 saying it's very important to their business. And again, I would point out here the 10% that don't know, but overall 49% have indicated that this is hugely important. So this is great information and speaking with lawmakers and getting the word out of the importance of this issue, not just to tech companies, but to everyone. And for those interested in this research, I'd be happy to send you a full copy of this report from Small Business Majority. So next we're going to hear from Ilyssa Meyer, who is the Manager of Public Policy and Research at ETSI, where she focuses on the challenges that creative entrepreneurs face when starting and running a micro business. Ilyssa produces research and analysis related to policy solutions that make it easier for micro entrepreneurs to operate on their own terms. She also leads ETSI's social impact programming and is passionate about working with local city officials, community organizations, and ETSI sellers to foster the spirit of entrepreneurship in ways that grow creative local communities. Ilyssa?
Hey, thank you so much for that warm intro. Excited to be talking to you all today. So for those of you who may not be familiar with ETSI, we're a marketplace for creative entrepreneurs to connect with customers around the globe. And as of last year, we had 1.9 million active Etsy sellers, 87% of whom are women. So when we talk about the business case for net neutrality, we really are talking about the micro business case for net neutrality. From our perspective, this issue tends to be framed as a battle between big cable business versus the big tech companies. But really at the heart of the issue are Etsy sellers who are able to access a global consumer base just with an idea and an internet connection. And that's why we've been so active in the fight to protect the open internet. We've been active since 2014, I believe, and we've been hosting panel discussions and roundtables with the former chairman and legislators from all levels of government, talking about why the internet matters for Etsy sellers who are running their creative businesses largely from home. 97% of our sellers work from their home, and 77% are businesses of one. And just to give you an idea of where Etsy sellers are located, we're in 99.9% of all U.S. counties, and I'm pretty sure the 0.01% is a patch of grass somewhere in America. So we are literally everywhere, and Congress people and senators love hearing from our sellers, and that's why we always jump on every opportunity to bring Etsy sellers directly into the conversation, because they're super impactful when talking about how the internet has allowed them to start and grow micro businesses on their own terms. And tomorrow we're excited to join some of the public interest groups and other companies in a day of action. We're going on red alert for net neutrality, and we'll be doing some really fun and big and splashy actions on our site, drawing attention to the business case for net neutrality as well. And so far, we've, during the open comment period, over 35,000 Etsy sellers wrote directly to the FCC, asking them not to repeal the rules. And since the repeal happened in December, which I think Evan will go into in a moment, over 40,000 messages have been generated to Congress so far. So we're looking forward to tomorrow's introduction of the CRA to protect the open internet. So be on the lookout for that. And I'm happy to jump in later on and answer any questions that you all may have.
Great, thank you, Ilyssa. And as far as questions go, everyone on the call can feel free to submit a question at any time using the Ask a Question feature, and then we will address all the questions at the end. So next we'll hear from Evan Engstrom, Executive Director at Engine, which is a nonprofit advocacy and research organization working to develop pro-startup public policies. Before becoming Engine's Executive Director, Evan served as the organization's first policy director. Prior to joining Engine, Evan was an attorney in private practice in San Francisco, focusing on intellectual property law. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Evan.
Thanks so much. So we've been working on net neutrality for, the past, pretty much as long as Engine's been around, since 2012. It really spiked, as Ilyssa said, in 2014, when the second most recent fight over the FCC's rules governing how internet service providers should treat traffic came live when a court threw out their 2010 rules. And I'm going to go through the whole kind of framework and history of the net neutrality rules to help ground you in what's at stake today, where the rules are today, and why that matters for small businesses. But to start, I think it's always useful to kind of define what we're talking about. When we say network neutrality, what do we mean? And at a high level, it's the principle that internet service providers, so the companies that control the pipes, so to speak, and provide users with access to the internet, they shouldn't be allowed to discriminate between certain sources of traffic. So the way to think about it is this: your cable company, which is for most Americans how they get internet to the access to the internet, shouldn't be allowed to act like a gatekeeper and treat different traffic coming to you differently. So when we think of gatekeepers, what do we mean? Well, if you're an ISP, you control the flow of information to and from every user on your network. So let's say I'm a subscriber to an ISP service, my cable company. Where I live, it's just Comcast. It's the only option that I have for high-speed internet service. So any company that I want to do business with on the internet, any company that I want to reach, any person I want to communicate with, has to go through Comcast. There's no other way to reach me on the internet. It's just Comcast. And consequently, this gives Comcast incredible power, because not only can they collect transaction fees from me as a subscriber, and I pay through the nose for what is really just mediocre service, they also can turn around and charge the website that wants to access me, right? So if I want to do business with Etsy, there's really nothing to stop Comcast from saying, okay, I have to pay money to reach Etsy, but Etsy also has to pay money for that traffic to get delivered to me. And there's really, really strong incentives for ISPs to do that. First of all, there's, like I said, there's almost no competition in broadband provision in America. Something between 60 to 75% of US households have access to 1 or 0 high-speed broadband providers. So if you don't like what your broadband provider is doing, your choice is no internet, which, as anyone who runs a business knows, isn't really a choice these days. And even in places where there is competition, there are still really, really strong gatekeeper incentives for platforms, because, or for ISPs, because no matter how many choices you have, let's say I have Comcast and AT&T somehow going into my house, I'm only going to subscribe to one, right? There's no reason for me to have 2 different cable companies providing the internet service. When I log on, I log in through one. Having 2 is crazy. So even when there is competition, there's only one way to get to you. And of course, there, some people now are using wireless broadband in addition to wireline, but the incentives are still the same. ISPs have very, very strong control over the information that flows to you, and they have a lot of incentive and capacity to monetize that gatekeeper power. And so net neutrality really is just the principle that you're not allowed to abuse that gatekeeper power. If you are an ISP, they can charge me as the user to access the internet, but they shouldn't be allowed to turn around and distort the market by charging different businesses and different websites to access me. I'm already paying for that capacity. There's no reason for them to create a 2-sided market, as they like to call it, and charge both ends of the equation. And so when we talk about net neutrality, we usually define it in 3 big rules that you might have heard about. We say you shouldn't be allowed to block, so no blocking. ISPs shouldn't be allowed to throttle different sources of traffic. And ISPs shouldn't be allowed to engage in paid prioritization. So what does that mean? Blocking, just what the name means. They shouldn't be allowed to say, hey, Etsy, if you don't pay me Comcast money, you're not allowed to reach your customers. Just not going to happen. That would be charging an access fee. Throttling is a similar thing. If you don't pay me money, I will slow down your traffic intentionally to sort of extort you into paying money. And the third one, paid prioritization, is sort of related to throttling. It basically says ISPs shouldn't be allowed to create fast lanes, so extra fast internet connections, and charge websites for access to those fast lanes. Because one of the reasons this is important is packet switching. The idea that packets going across the internet, all else being equal, is a zero-sum game. If my packets go ahead of yours, my stuff's going to get delivered first. And so we don't want to give website or ISPs the incentive to charge for fast lane access. These are kind of the big principles that are baked into most net neutrality proposals. They're the key ones. And they're important because, again, they prevent ISPs from distorting traffic on the internet to their own financial advantage. So why should small businesses care about this? Well, to begin with, when we talk about the internet, it's obviously a broad platform for commerce. There are large companies on there. There are small companies on there. And to the extent that ISPs want to charge for something like priority access, it seems very likely that large businesses will have the financial means to acquire those paid priority access lanes to the detriment of smaller players. Because as we said, if you're not in the paid priority access lane, your traffic will be slowed down relative to the person who is paying for it. So if you're a small website that wants to compete with somebody like Amazon in the e-commerce space, good luck outbidding Amazon for access to that priority lane. Your traffic is just going to go more slowly than Amazon's does. And because of that, there's a real power to distort the marketplace to favor large incumbents. Simply put, startups don't have the capacity to pay for this type of priority arrangement. The average startup only raises somewhere around $75,000 in seed capital from outside investors. Comparing that to some of the largest businesses in the entire world, there's just no way to think that they would be able to compete. And so there's a real possibility that these companies will be slowed down to the degree where their services are either unusable or problematic. And we know that having even small latency times, so a small decrease in the performance of your website, results in very, very significant negative consequences in terms of consumer engagement. There are studies showing that just a few milliseconds of page loading times will cause people to leave your website. And if you're a small business, you don't have the kind of brand trust and reputation to mitigate those types of concerns. If your website is slow, consumers will just go to a different website that they're more familiar with that doesn't load slowly. And this is, of course, a sort of a natural phenomenon, and it's played out in a way that ISPs have treated this type of traffic in the past. There's a sort of a famous case that launched this whole debate over net neutrality more recently, when Comcast was slowing down BitTorrent traffic. BitTorrent is a protocol for exchanging files on the internet. Comcast went in and slowed it down intentionally. And the reason they slowed it down rather than blocking it outright is because they made the determination that if you slow it down, consumers are more likely to blame BitTorrent. But if you block it, they're more likely to blame Comcast. So they know consumers, if your website performs slowly, your customers aren't going to say, oh, well, that's Comcast's fault. They're going to blame the website. And so it has a real negative impact on startup competition. So this reverberates throughout the economy. Pretty much every small business is an internet-enabled small business at this point. So if you are on the internet, you really should be concerned about the impact this is going to have on your business. So taking a step back here, let's talk about very quickly, the history of net neutrality to explain what the legal landscape looks like today. So historically, you couldn't really engage in the type of priority access and sort of slowing down and blocking shenanigans that ISPs want to get into, because you couldn't identify the sources of traffic. Well, now you can. So ISPs can determine where traffic is coming from and treat different internet traffic differently. So the debate about net neutrality kind of turns on this question of who in government should be regulating the internet and how should they be regulating the internet. When we say the internet, it's important to distinguish between websites, what we call edge providers, and internet service providers, basically, the infrastructure people, the guys that build the pipes and control the pipes. This is about controlling the pipes and preventing the people who own the pipes from distorting what goes through those pipes. It's not about regulating websites. That has nothing to do with net neutrality. So the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has the legal authority to govern communications networks in this country. So phone, radio, anything that is a communications network, the FCC has authority from Congress to regulate this. And Congress delegates this authority, right? So it's an agency, it's an independent agency. Whatever power they have to regulate these networks has to come from Congress. Congress says, all right, you have the authority to regulate radio, you have the authority to regulate phones. Well, here's this new communications medium that pops up, the internet. What do? There are a number of laws that touch upon how the internet should be regulated or can be regulated by the FCC, but the FCC has some discretion to determine how to regulate it. And this discretion turns upon kind of two questions. One, what kind of network is it? And number two, whatever this network is, however we define it, what sort of rules should be applied to it? So very quickly, in the early days of the internet, they made this distinction between sort of what we call telecommunication services or basic services, which are just like pure transmission. I am sending data across a pipe. It's not being manipulated in any way. The service of providing that pipe is a telecommunication service. Or are they like manipulating the data? Are they providing an information processing service on top of it? That's a different service, and we're going to regulate that one a little more heavily. So the question becomes, depending on how you define this service, what rules are you allowed to apply to it? And we'll flash forward to 2010. In 2010, the FCC decided to codify principles of net neutrality that were established at the FCC in the early 2000s and say, you're not allowed to engage in these types of practices. You're not allowed as an ISP to block access to websites. You're not allowed to throttle them. You're not allowed to engage in certain forms of paid prioritization. And a court threw out those rules for dense regulatory reasons, which we can go into later if it's interesting, but they threw them out. In 2014, the FCC kind of had to rethink how it was going to establish these rules. It changed its regulatory authority, but instituted, in some ways stronger rules than were in place in 2010. Again, based upon these general principles of no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization. And that was the law of the land. It survived a court order, a court challenge in 2015, 2016, and it's been the law of the land until this recent FCC decided we're going to undo that. We're going to remove those rules around throttling, blocking, paid prioritization. We're basically not going to regulate internet service providers at all when it comes to how they treat internet traffic. And instead, we're just going to allow a different agency, the Federal Trade Commission, we're going to let them review what ISPs do based upon this idea of, well, if they promise not to do bad things, are they keeping up their promises? So as long as an ISP says we're not going to engage in these practices, theoretically the FTC can come in and say, well, you didn't uphold your bargain. We're gonna take you to task for it. But as long as ISPs don't promise to prevent to refrain from engaging in prioritization, the FTC doesn't do anything. So these rules on the books that had been in place in principle form for many, many years, and then from 2010 on in actual enforceable rules at the FCC, have been rescinded. And now ISPs are free to engage in paid prioritization, in throttling traffic and blocking traffic from certain sources of certain websites. And what's critically important here is this isn't a theoretical harm. ISPs have engaged in this type of behavior in the past. There are many examples of ISPs selectively blocking certain types of applications or throttling applications. And we know that they want to be able to engage in this practice because it makes them money. In that court challenge to the 2010 rules, Verizon's counsel explicitly said, we want to be able to charge websites to access end users and block those that don't pay. The rules that were in place from 2010 to the recent reversal at the FCC had an impact. Companies couldn't do that. And so by getting rid of them, we're opening up this possibility that ISPs will start creating fast lanes to discriminate against certain sources of traffic and sell those off to the highest bidders. And of course, who's going to be the highest bidder? Very, very rich, very large incumbents. And that's going to distort the market for small businesses and make it much, much more expensive for a small business to launch and compete. And so I think it's really important that we push back against this. And with that, I'll pass it off to Phillip, who can talk a little bit more about the state of play currently and what's likely to happen in the next year or so, or next few months in terms of net neutrality.
Great. So I'll just preface that Phillip is a senior policy counsel at Public Knowledge. His work focuses on broadband competition, deployment and affordability, telecommunications and media mergers, spectrum policy, and copyright reform. He regularly works with consumers, civil rights, public interest, and industry stakeholders, advises policymakers on Capitol Hill, the Federal Communications Commission, and at executive agencies. Phillip.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to walk folks through a couple of different efforts that are ongoing right now to address, repeal, push back on, or step into the breach to protect the open internet that are underway in response to the action the FCC took in December when they voted on what they call the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. This is the net neutrality repeal order. And then at the end, I'm going to sort of give folks a couple of different flavors of ways that they can get involved if they're interested. And for folks who want to reach out to us here at Public Knowledge, you're always happy to. I'm always happy to hear from you and take questions and help you figure out how to engage. So on that note, in December, on December 14th, the FCC voted 3-2 to adopt what they call the Restoring Internet Freedom Order. And this order essentially repealed the FCC's 2015 Open Internet rules, the Open Internet Order that had been adopted in February of 2015. And as Evan mentioned, that order had been upheld in court by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. The Restoring Internet Freedom Order essentially eliminates the FCC's no blocking, no throttling. Hello, can folks still hear me? Okay. The December order essentially eliminates the FCC's no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization rules. It eliminates the FCC's authority to provide any meaningful oversight of anti-competitive behavior by internet service providers. And it essentially transfers oversight of ISPs to the Federal Trade Commission, and that process looks basically like self-regulation. The companies are required to tell consumers how they will treat internet traffic, but there's no guarantee of no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization, and the FTC can only take action if it appears that the ISPs have not lived up to the commitments they've made to consumers. And those commitments can be changed at any time. So similar to folks who might have a Facebook account or a Twitter account or essentially any online account right now, you're seeing the privacy updates related to GDPR, and other times you see privacy updates throughout the year. Those are updates that you basically have to opt into to continue to use the service. So while you have a choice whether to opt in, you don't have a choice to use the service if you don't opt in. That's the choice you'll be making with ISPs with their terms of service requirements. So they can change those at any time. So if they decide to enter into those sort of pay-to-play arrangements that Verizon indicated they wanted to do when they argued this case at the DC Circuit, more than 5 years ago, they will be able to do that just as long as they bury it in fine print in their consumer terms of service. So that order passed the FCC in December of 2017. The order was published in the Federal Register in February 22nd. There was a date that was listed in that Federal Register publication as the quote effective date unquote, but there still is a process that needs to be worked through at the Office of Management and Budget. So the effective date of the net neutrality repeal is still to be determined. So as of today and as of tomorrow, the 2015 rules that are no blocking, no throttling, no paid prioritization are still on the books. Those are still the law. So if you hear anybody, raise this issue to you saying, well, the internet isn't broken and there are no net neutrality protections now, that is inaccurate. The net neutrality protections from 2015 are still on the books. They have not yet been wiped off the books. That will happen at a later date to be determined. So that's sort of the procedural stance of the FCC's order. And a few things that are underway right now to deal with, to either overturn the repeal or, there are some efforts at the state and local levels to step in and protect consumers and small businesses where the FCC has abdicated its responsibility. So the first of those is something called the Congressional Review Act. This is the Congressional Review Act was a 1996 law that allows Congress to overturn new federal rules or agency orders via an expedited legislative process. It requires a simple majority of both houses to pass, and it's a joint resolution, and then it requires a signature by the president, and it would overturn an agency rule or order, and also it has the impact of making sure that the agency can't do something substantially similar without express congressional direction. Congress has 60 days to approve a CRA once the agency's order appears in the Federal Register and has been formally submitted to Congress. And as I mentioned, that happened in February, so that clock is ticking right now. And there is an effort underway right now to use the CRA to overturn the FCC's net neutrality repeal. And business organizations have been actively involved in this effort, including the American Sustainable Business Council, which is hosting this call, and thank you very much. Engine Advocacy, which Evan just spoke, and the Internet Association, which is the trade association that represents the largest technology companies in the world. Senator Markey in the Senate side has introduced a CRA. It is SJ Res 52. It currently has 49 co-sponsors, and 50 senators have indicated they will vote yes. That is enough with the current makeup of the Senate to actually pass this resolution. Senator McCain, unfortunately, due to his health reasons, will likely be absent when this comes up for a vote next week. So, it's likely based on the current count that the CRA could pass 50 to 49, but there continues to be a need for folks to reach out to congressional offices to encourage Republican members of Congress to sign on to the CRA. So if folks have a home state Democratic senator and are interested in taking action and reaching out, you can bolster your senator's support for the CRA. If you have a home state Republican senator, you can reach out and ask them to support the CRA, because net neutrality is important for small businesses to reach consumers and market access. So that process, there will be a discharge petition filed tomorrow morning, which will create a floor vote on the CRA, and then a floor vote is expected next week on either May 15th or May 16th. The House has a similar process, but less friendly procedures to expedite a floor vote. Currently, Congressman Mike Doyle of Pennsylvania has introduced HJ Res 129. He has 160 co-sponsors, but the way to get to the House floor is either the House Energy and Commerce Committee has to approve the resolution and send it to the floor, or a majority of the House, so 218 members, would need to take action to force a vote. So we would need about an additional 60 members of the House to sign on to that. The hope here is that if we can get a landslide of support from Republican Senate members, once it becomes clear that the CRA will pass the Senate, that it will put pressure on Republican House members to join the CRA. And the reason for that is this, I think we walked through the polling data earlier. From a constituent standpoint, this is an issue that has 86% of support from the public. 86% of the public opposes the FCC's net neutrality repeal. So there's danger in this for members of Congress who oppose this. So that's the CRA process that's playing out in Congress. There's also a court challenge to the FCC's order. Currently, 23 state attorney generals have filed lawsuits against the FCC. Others have also filed lawsuits, including my organization, Public Knowledge, several other public interest and civil rights organizations. Companies have filed lawsuits, companies like Vimeo, Etsy, Mozilla. Encompass, which is a business group that represents competitive broadband providers, has filed a lawsuit. The California Public Utilities Commission, the County of Santa Clara, California, and others have also filed litigation against the FCC challenging their December net neutrality repeal order. The issues likely to be raised in litigation are that the FCC violated the Administrative Procedure Act in several ways. So, for instance, they failed to give adequate weight to the evidence in the record, and that they unreasonably gave extreme weight to some of the dubious data regarding investment and deployment by broadband providers, data that's been largely debunked or runs contrary to the public statements and public filings at the SEC that these companies have provided. Additionally, the FCC misrepresents its own history of being a regulator in the broadband space in a way that makes the order arbitrary and capricious and violates the Administrative Procedure Act. And finally, the FCC provides a flawed legal analysis that unreasonably interprets its authority in a very narrow way under the Communications Act, and we believe that that interpretation is not entitled to any deference by the DC Circuit. So those are some of the arguments that you'll likely see. There may be other arguments that are raised, but largely this is, a complaint and an issue that will deal with some of these core issues of administrative law. Lastly, not lastly, but there's also efforts underway in Congress to deal with net neutrality through legislation. These efforts are sort of at a nascent stage, but essentially this is all dictated by the polling data that I mentioned earlier. In December, 83% of Americans were found through a poll run by the University of Maryland, 83% of Americans said that they opposed repealing net neutrality protections, including 75% of Republicans. And then in April of this year, the same polling outfit released a study that showed that 86% of Americans opposed the repeal, including 82% of Republicans, so that's up 7% since December, and 90% of Democrats. So even members of Congress that have historically been opposed to net neutrality protections in any way, shape, or form have had to come forward with some manner of net neutrality protections. So, for instance, Congresswoman Marsha Blackburn, who is the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Telecom Subcommittee, introduced a bill back in December of last year that would make blocking and throttling of internet traffic illegal, but it fails to do a lot of important things, like address things like paid prioritization, address things like interconnection fees that can basically amount to blocking or throttling of web traffic just on the other side of the interconnection to the last mile network. It prevents the FCC from actually investigating internet net neutrality complaints. It prevents the states from doing this job if the FCC decides to abdicate its authority. So it does something good with the blocking and throttling protections, but it still falls well short of the protections that consumers and small businesses have been living under since the 2015 rules went into effect and expect from their internet service providers. The last piece, there are some state and local efforts to protect net neutrality that are afoot. During the last year, 29 states have proposed legislation to reinstate some form of net neutrality rules. 2 states so far have passed legislation and signed it into law. Those are Oregon and Washington State. Some of the more high-profile states that are looking at this right now include California, New York, Connecticut just passed a bill through its state Senate. So efforts are underway and will likely continue in the 2019 legislative session in most states as well. 5 states have signed executive orders, which basically say that the state will only do business with ISPs that refrain from blocking and throttling internet traffic and commit to protecting an open internet. So those states are Montana, Hawaii, Vermont, New Jersey, New York. And then there are also local efforts from cities to protect the open internet. So there's an effort underway called the Cities Open Internet Pledge, and you can find details for that at mayorsfornetneutrality.org. But more than 100 mayors across the US have signed on, committing that their cities will not do business with ISPs that won't commit to abstain from blocking, throttling, or engaging in paid prioritization of web traffic. And some of the cities on that list, if you're interested, are cities like Portland, Oregon, Kansas City, Missouri, Madison, Wisconsin, Durham, North Carolina, Edgewater, Colorado, Pembroke Pines, Florida. It's a list of 100 mayors from large and small cities. So you can find that. You can find details of that at mayorsfornetneutrality.org. But it's a pretty extensive list. And some of these cities, like Morgantown, West Virginia, or Sheboygan, Wisconsin, you might not necessarily think of as hotbeds for net neutrality activism, but it's an issue that has galvanized the public and small business community. So what can you do? So just a couple of quick things that you can do. I mentioned earlier, the Senate is voting next week on either the 15th or 16th on the CRA to overturn the FCC's net neutrality repeal order. You can call your senator and tell your senator that the small business community needs net neutrality. This is a market access issue, and you want your senator to protect your access to the global market, and the internet and the openness of the internet is important for that. So that is happening next week. A discharge petition will be filed tomorrow by Senator Markey. That process will cascade and provide momentum to the effort that's underway in the House to build support for a majority of House members to move a floor vote on the CRA in the House. The second thing, which I think Ilyssa alluded to this earlier, is the red alert. So if you go to battleforthenet.com/red alert, there's information there about the red alert for net neutrality, which begins tomorrow on May 9th. Sites online will feature home pages with splashes and in-application messages to drive calls and emails to Congress, and companies as diverse as Etsy, Reddit, Tumblr, Video, and many other online companies are involved in this effort. And if you want to get involved, you can reach out to me, or you can go through the Battle for the Net site. But that is starting tomorrow, May 9th. So time is of the essence there. That's largely what I have. If folks have any other questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me online, but I'm also happy to take questions through the Q&A here.
Great, thanks, Phillip. First, I have a note from one of our members, Adam at Intex Solutions out of California. And Adam, if you're able to share audio, I've unmuted you. Can you see if you can speak?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, good afternoon. Yeah, I don't know a ton about this issue, but still trying to learn and get involved because we're a small business in Los Angeles, and we perform environmentally responsible cleaning services to make commercial buildings healthier. And we recently actually had some issues with our internet speeds, and it just made it really difficult for our employees to do their jobs and take care of customers and everything. We believe that the internet is a utility and should not play favorites. And I'm just really concerned about what kind of challenges this is going to create for us as small businesses, and how it's going to impact our employees and our customers, and also from we really we don't like the idea of it limiting smaller entrepreneurial companies from competing with the big giants. So I'm all for a level playing field and competition, and I think now's a really important time for even the small companies like ourselves to bring our voices together and share our stories and thoughts, and not let just one ISPs or the FCC alone dictate what's going to happen. So our stories matter, and I think they can have a positive impact. So looking forward to being involved how I can.
Great, thanks, Adam. Another one that I'll summarize that came in is just regarding all of the state legislation going on, and why is the state legislation important in addition to the federal, and why does that matter if we're trying to fix it federally, that there are all these state cases? And I'll leave this one open to anyone who wants to answer.
I can jump in here. This is Evan. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Number one, the time horizon of the federal government, the federal judiciary dealing with this problem is a little long term. I think it's unlikely that there's going to be a new sort of like let's assume the CRA goes through, which I think is uncertain. You're probably not going to see Congress creating a new net neutrality law anytime soon. The litigation is going to take a while. Litigation is a slow process. So undoing the FCC's order when it goes into effect is going to take a while. And states can sort of fill in this gap and prevent ISPs from doing bad stuff in the interim. And the reason that's important here is a couple of reasons. Number one, if a state like California institutes net neutrality rules, it kind of serves as a de facto national standard in a lot of ways, because so many companies and users and ISPs are based here that it would be pretty weird and difficult, given the sort of borderless nature of the internet, to create wildly different rules or wildly different business models for ISPs for California and then for everywhere else. So they kind of have to sort of set the bar at the California standard and follow that throughout the country. So it's sort of like a de facto national standard. And the legality of this is, I think, sort of an open question. Can the FCC prevent states from doing this? there's at least a plausible argument that says no, by basically giving up their authority to regulate internet service providers generally, they can't then turn around and preempt states from doing this, which they try to do in their order. So it's both potentially a legally viable approach and one that sort of puts this into a faster process than if you were just to wait for the federal government to engage.
Great, thanks. I'll throw one in that we haven't talked too much about. We've talked a lot about the business perspective and businesses' opinions on this issue, but I was curious if anyone had ideas for how customers could be better engaged in the issue in different situations. Is there a value to sharing your advocacy positions with your customers and engaging them on the issue as well? If anyone would like to jump in on that.
Yeah, hey, this is Ilyssa from Etsy. So I think Etsy buyers are just as revved up about this issue as Etsy sellers. Etsy sellers definitely advocate on the issue from a micro business perspective, but I think buyers are just as conscious of what the repeal of the rules would do for their ability to connect with these micro entrepreneurs who are running businesses from across the world. So yeah, I think tomorrow we're also, for the day of action and beyond, we're targeting both buyers and sellers to take action on the issue because we see it definitely, we're a two-sided marketplace and both sides, both buyers and sellers are very passionate about this issue.
Great, thank you. And the last one I'm seeing here in the question section is just about the CRA and how the experts here on the call feel if it can pass the House of Representatives and then earn the president's signature after passing the Senate. If anyone would like to jump in on that.
Yes, this is Phillip from Public Knowledge. I'll jump in on this. So you know, the Senate process right now, we've got 50 confirmed votes, which with Senator McCain's absence, it's likely that we have the votes to pass. There's some thought and some evidence from meetings on Capitol Hill that once it becomes clear that this will pass the Senate, that other senators who have otherwise been silent on this issue but may have reservations about the radical nature of what the FCC did back in December might pile on. You know, you tend to see that in a lot of votes in the legislature. Once it becomes something clear, something will pass or something will fail, people will jump onto whichever side has better polling or or for whatever other reason. So whereas this looks like a 50-49 vote right now, you could see this ending up with upwards of in the high 50s or touching 60 votes, depending on how the chips fall. So given that, if that were to happen, if you had red state senators jump onto this CRA at the last minute, that puts pressure on their House counterparts, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. That combined with the polling data, which overwhelmingly shows their constituents favor this, pushes from local business groups. The most effective advocacy on a whole range of issues is when local constituents and local business owners go into the district office of a member of Congress and explain to them why they want them to be on one side of our policy or the other. So that sort of personal outreach is critical into shifting the balance here. So those three things: the momentum from a positive Senate vote, outreach from constituents and small businesses, especially to the member directly if you have a line to your member, or to their local office, and the polling data is the hope to build momentum for that House vote. And frankly, with this president, he's a mercurial guy. So you had a president who said he wasn't going to sign this omnibus funding bill that funded the government a few weeks ago, and then a couple hours later he signed it. He has talked about several issues and said he supports X or opposes Y, and then done the opposite when push comes to shove and political pressure comes to bear. So, you know, I don't think anybody can read the tea leaves and know what the president will do in any instance, but pressure on the House, you know, I think will be effective in pressuring the president to take the same step if the House can pass this.
Great, thank you. With all questions, I think, being answered, I'll kind of close us out here. It's been an excellent discussion of the history of net neutrality, the lay of the land, and what businesses can do today to get involved. I would say, you know, you're just talking about visiting district offices, and if this is something that some folks on the call haven't done before, and you have cold feet, I would say that all the experts on this call are probably happy to help. ASBC has tons of resources about doing your first advocacy work and getting into those in-person meetings. We'd be more than happy to help you out. And I think it's really clear that your voice as a business does make a difference right now, and in particular on this issue. So I just want to thank our friends first at Small Business Majority and Main Street Alliance for helping us host and get the word out about this webinar. And we've got a sign-on effort there at netneutrality.asbcouncil.org. And then for those interested in learning more about the Red Alert campaign that Etsy and Public Knowledge are participating in, along with many other businesses, check out battleforthenet.com/Red Alert. Any questions that anyone has, or if you're looking to get in touch with the other expert presenters that we've heard from here today, feel free to get in touch with me, and we'll get you connected. And with that, I say thank you to Ilyssa and Evan and Phillip, and look forward to seeing what happens over the next couple of weeks with this issue.